Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Dialogues for Tomorrow. And thank you for joining us in Vienna and around the world. My name is Noit Banai, and I'm visiting professor of art history at the University of Applied Arts in Vienna. In the series Dialogues for Tomorrow, the University of Applied Arts Vienna invites artists and scientists to outline their respective views of tomorrow in the run-up to the Angewandte Festival, which takes place between June 23rd and June 26th. My guest today, I'm very, very happy that he could join us in this conversation, is Ibrahim Mahama. Ibrahim Mahama is an artist born in Tamale, Ghana, and he lives and works in Accra, Kumasi, and Tamale, Ghana. His work has been included in the 56th, the 57th, and 58th Venice Biennial, in Documenta 14 in Athens and Kassel, in Orderly, Disorderly in Accra, Images, an age of our own making in Denmark, and most recently, the Parliament of Ghosts at the Whitworth Art Gallery in Manchester, and currently at the 22nd Sydney Biennial. He also spent a year in Berlin on a DAAD fellowship, and importantly for our conversation, in March 2019, he opened the SCCA Tamale, which is an artist-run space built and dedicated to retrospectives of practices which emerged from the 20th century. His current interests are using specific architectural forms within history in the formation of spaces inspired by the potentialities and failures of modernity. Welcome so much and so warmly, Ibrahim, and thank you very much for joining us in these dialogues for tomorrow.
Oh, thank you very much, Nui.
So I met Ibrahim in Tirana in 2019. Yes. We were both there to participate in an exhibition and its programming at the time that the earthquake struck Tirana. So it was another time of crisis and another time of reflection on the future. And it struck me that Ibrahim's work suggests that we cannot think of tomorrow without embedding the traces of history and memory in it somehow. And we cannot imagine any kind of future or speculative future without forms and materials that carry traces and complexities of both history and memory. So to start off our conversation in this context of Dialogues for Tomorrow, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about your work, why your work focuses on what you call the carcass of history, and why you find it important to embed and produce memory as part of your practice.
Well, thank you very much, Nui. I guess for my practice started when I was in art school, not so long ago. And I think pedagogy has always been very important, particularly to us coming from Ghana here, because most of my colleagues and I, we had very specific arts training in a sense that we were thinking about ways in which we could think about new ways in which art could be experienced and art could be produced. Because a lot of the dialogue that we've had in art, like post-colonial, it mostly doesn't really get any far or anywhere because we still somehow revolve around using the using the notion and the history of art itself as a starting point, even in like art, like in schools, in teaching and all that. So a lot of artists somehow, in order to produce art, they somehow have to rely on art itself in order to produce art. But in the space, in the school that I came from, we thought that it was important somehow to go beyond the context of art history and go into like the systems of production and then how history affects it and all that. Of course, coming from the continent, it's a lot more complicated also within that in terms of looking at like post-colonial discourse and all that. So there's a lot of materials which are mostly around, which are never really considered in the process of making art. And also, there are a lot of systems which are there. So for instance, In Ghana, for instance, some of the negotiations that you have to go through in order to produce, let's say, a work of art might not necessarily be the same as it is if you were to produce a work in Europe, because of the systems that are in place. So for me, I thought that it was important somehow to intercept some of these things, because post-independent societies in Africa, a lot of them had so much promise at the time, mostly within the 60s, when there were all these independent revolutions and revolutions also that were happening. But a lot of them somehow fell short after a certain period. After the 70s, with the structural adjustment program and all that, we almost fell back into time again. So there's always been a certain gap within our history. And each time we think about what the future is, we think that the future is something which is yet to emerge. But I've always thought that the future has always been something which has been stuck in the past. And in order for us to renew it, we need to somehow do a certain time travel. It's like going into science and doing some kind of a space-time continuum, going back into the past in order to be able to pick up things which can resolve the future. And mostly you can find them within like memories, through objects, archives, the decay of things around us in our society.
Thank you for that really rich answer. I'm wondering, when you say that the future has always been with us, but somehow stuck in the past, do you mean specifically the moment of decolonization and independence? Or do you mean different layers of history that come before it as well? And where do you have a kind of moment of the origin of this future that you try to reconnect with?
No, not necessarily. I think they are very different moments. So for instance, one of the things is that I have always been interested in history way back. So like even looking back to, let's say, archaeology. So not just within modern history, within the 20th century. Of course, my interest into art was looking at spaces, architectural spaces in Ghana that were built during the colonial period. So looking at spaces that emerged around the late 19th century. So let's say post-independence on the continent. So you're looking at buildings that were put up in 1960, 1970, to buildings that were put up in the early 20th century, like railway stations and workshops that were constructed by the British, the colonialists, for the exploitation of resources. And these same mechanisms were used in exploiting, let's say, objects, archaeological objects, which are now in Western institutions. And on the continent, we still have these, we still have sites which have a lot of archaeology, or there's always materials that are there, but we never somehow connect to, because there has never really been a real sense of seriousness in investing into infrastructure, which somehow plays also towards the rethinking about like culture within contemporary societies. So I wanted to use the idea of the post-independence because I thought it was really important, because Ghana, for instance, in the post-independent era, there was a lot of buildings that were built by Eastern European architects. At the time during the Cold War, there was a lot of tension between the East and the West, looking at issues regarding liberation, thinking about freedom, whereas the West was thinking about how to push forward the agenda of capital and all that. So, and it's some of the issues that we are currently even dealing with within this period, here and now, because we've been asking some of these questions for quite a long time. But I think that the foundations of some of the questions have always been somehow misled, because in order to address certain fundamental realities, we need to go back to maybe a certain period in time. And I think that architecture somehow plays a role. So for me, though I'm interested in the architecture from the post-independence, I want to see how that can go back as far back as 2,000 years ago, and somehow maybe go back into culture and practices and time in a very different way, and then somehow see how we can use that as a new form of projection of looking at how maybe a certain future with a narrative can be constructed.
So you are reconnecting or making visible certain genealogies that may have remained dormant or forgotten, or that were exploited in ways that perhaps led to futures we would rather not have, or leading to it. So it's this genealogical search or genealogical reconnection through, but specifically through architectural forms, from what I understand, and through materials. And maybe you can tell us why your investigation, which of course has this very rigorous theoretical basis, why it actually occurs through, let's say, the monumentalization of certain objects, the monumentalization materials and of certain spaces. And if you would like me to show an image for our audience, I'd be happy to.
Yeah, I think it would be good just to play some of maybe just to put the slides up. Yeah.
Okay, I'll do that. Here we go.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, wonderful. Yeah. So I think, yeah, the image on the screen is the National Theatre of Ghana. And it was one of the projects that I did in 2016, early part of 16, as part of a larger project which I did called the Exchange Exchanger in Ghana. And it actually dealt with looking into the history of monuments and like spaces around the country. This building was built in 1992 by the Chinese, with money, of course, from Chinese. 1992 was also the same time that Ghana became a fully democratic country in terms of going to the polls with the constitution. And the other buildings that were connected to this, which I was looking at, was these group of brutalist silos, concrete silos that were built by Eastern European architects in the early 60s. Modernist buildings that were built as accommodation blocks for students at the university in Kumasi. Just some private buildings that were brutalist in nature that were built in like the early 90s, and also affordable housing buildings, public housing units that were built in the early 2000s for public accommodations but were never completed. So I was somehow investigating all these different spaces and trying to find the common aesthetics and also political underpinnings that were there within these structures. But the material which I was using at the time, the jute sack, was very important to me because of the aligning conditions within the material, because of how it is made, like imported into Ghana from India and Bangladesh, of course, knowing the labor factors that come from like those regions in the world, and then used in the transportation of commodities, which they'll go back to Europe. And then the excess capital is then now sent to the continent and the peripheries, spaces around the world in the form of NGOs to somehow fight towards fair trade and child labor and things like that. They were paradoxes. They are somehow paradoxes because when capital exploits, it almost forgets about the thing or the conditions that it's exploiting. And then later it wants to come back with its excesses to see how it can somehow readdress the condition, but you cannot address the condition with the surplus necessarily. You have to address the condition from the beginning. Like you have to stop the exploitation for that condition even to begin with, you know. So I somehow have tried as much as possible to use some of these points as a way to maybe create these kind of dialogues in my work.
Thank you for taking us through this particular work and through this idea of the surplus. And I wonder if you consider this a kind of visual surplus in a way, or visualize.
Yes, this is one visual surplus. Yes.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I'm asking this also because we are in a moment, a kind of a pivotal historical moment where monuments are being destroyed. Not only in the United States and in Europe, but also formerly in Eastern Europe after the fall of the Berlin Wall, after the end of communism. There was a kind of iconoclastic move against monuments that we are also living through today. And your work started from this kind of counter-monumentalization. And maybe you can talk to us a little bit about how it relates to our moment today.
Well, I think there was a project I did in 2018, early part, with a curator called Antonia Lampi from Savi. And it was with Extra City in Antwerp with the Middelheim Museum, which was addressing the issues of monuments in Belgium. At the time, there was a particular monument in in Antwerp of a Roman priest, Father the Deacon, with a Congolese, so-called Congolese savage at his feet. And it was quite important to address the monument because the monument was originally made in bronze, but we were thinking about ways in which we could subvert the notion of the monument and also bring people into thinking about what these sculptures and monuments have meant within our history. In Congo, when the citizens had their hands chopped off because they could not produce enough rubber from the plantations and all that. And of course, we've known that there was a chocolate factory in Belgium that was making the chocolates out of these hands, almost making mockery of that part of history. So I thought that it was important to use, even just to play with material. So to use the idea of rubber in itself as a raw material to reproduce the sculpture, but then produce the sculpture in such a way that it will be in clay and it will be brought into the institutional context for debates, and then also thinking about ways in which we could rethink about what an idea of a monument is vis-a-vis maybe the problems that it has, and then maybe promises or different forms in which monuments can take. So that took that form of the exhibition. But in my own work at home, I've always been thinking about ways in which, because as artists, we're constantly thinking about ways in which we can produce objects. But it's also important for us to also think about creating new forms of monuments in the form of institutions, which can somehow be more utilitarian, which can somehow serve a larger societal context. So SCCA, which we were talking about before, was also as a result of that.
Okay,
you can skip through the images. Yeah, you can show the image from there. Yes.
Do you want me to show all of them?
Yes, I think, this is part of the workshop programs that we hold with students as part of the exhibitions that we organize. So then now, the idea of the monumentality in terms of like working with these massive infrastructures or looking into monuments and then trying to deduce them, their energy and then also the ideological factors behind that was what was somehow sifted and then poured into the creation of this institution, which somehow works with children and young people in a way of allowing them to rethink about the way that the world is constructed, from using art as a starting point.
There's a lot to talk about here. I just want to perhaps respond to a few great ideas that you put on the table. The first is that in your work, you start with a kind of, let's say, monumentalization of systems that have been, let's say, invisible, the invisible hand of capital that becomes kind of externalized or materialized in your work. With the very specific materials, very specific choice of forms. Then you also mentioned in this project that you are interested in bringing these objects into Western institutions somehow, as not as a way to, let's say, perform iconoclasm in the literal way, but actually in a more subtle and way to disrupt the kind of institutional collection or institutional structure somehow. And now we're talking about an institution that you have founded, and I'm wondering if you can also tell us more about what happens at the SCAA. What is the premise? What kind of pedagogy? You were talking very early on about the pedagogy that you received in your early art schooling. What kind of pedagogy do you think is necessary today to open up new questions?
Yeah, I think the question of the gift is very important. It's one that we must focus on. So how can we use the idea of a gift as a starting point for artistic practice? So so for instance, in reading Marx or reading someone like David Harvey, or looking into, let's say, Rancière or Walter Benjamin's proposal of the idea of looking at production systems and how maybe artists or practitioners can somehow create new systems of production which they can own collectively, which can somehow begin to push the boundaries of society or the way in society is constructed, was one of the starting points for thinking about this kind of institutional building. Because as an artist, you can somehow lie on the wave of producing one big international exhibition to the other. And mostly it's for Western audiences, because on the continent, they've been, as I mentioned before, there are very little institutions or very little investment that are made into creating spaces of freedom for younger generations and all that. And in order to actually allow to create room for the understanding of, let's say, contemporary arts and culture, some of these institutions need to exist. So in creating my work from art school and knowing, using all these theories as a starting point, I always knew that I wanted to use the contradiction of it as a way to create this institution, because the jute sacks, which carry this cocoa that somehow speaks to the exploitation of labor, is what I use in producing artworks, which are sold to Western collections. And then the same money is the thing that is used in building this institution, which then now children can go to and then do workshops or have film screenings or see major exhibitions of, let's say, 20th century artists, practice of artists who practiced in the 20th century till now, that ordinarily you would have never had, they would have never had access to, because of the lack of infrastructure, which somehow deals with the modern, even with the archaeology. So I started actually building this series of spaces, and SCCA was one of the spaces. So SCCA is mainly dedicated to, I think when you skip, there are some images. So SCCA was one of them. And then there's red clay. I think it's one of the images. Yes. So this, so I think the next image. The
next image.
Yes.
Here
so
we go.
the red clay, yes, the red clay, this image, there's one which shows a closer image of the airplanes. Yes, so this was the second institution that I started working on. This is an old image, but it is the idea was to find ways in which we could bring different monuments or sites or things into the idea of the institutional context. So hence you see the airplanes. And the airplanes are things that, of course, children are fascinated by. And the idea was to use that as a way to create these learning spaces, classrooms, because the land around it, we are also using it for agriculture and all that. So trying to establish a relationship between these objects which seem so distant, but at the same time, you can see an airplane and a farm all within the same picture, or you can see a parliament and then, let's say, agriculture within the same picture, or you can see, let's say, a studio or an archive or film lab or theater within the context of, let's say, a farm. So the idea of labor has always been something which is very important, and it's not just from the point of building the institution, but it's also from the point of the community that is around it and how they're going to contribute to their own labor in terms of their time, in ways of developing the institution and carrying it forward into the future.
So do the participants, the students, the community, do they have a stake in it? Do they have a share in it, a financial share or financial stake as well? Does their labor also go into that, or all that comes from your, let's say, your kind of market value in Western institutions?
Yeah, most of that comes from my market value in Western institutions, but the institution is built as a public institution and as a public trust. So it means that even in my own work, most of the projects or installations that I've done in the last 6-7 years since I've been very active as an artist, I have tried as much as possible to gift all of it to the community. So in creating spaces which then now the work or the practice becomes a gift to the society in a way that the society will find new ways to deal with.
And, you know, our time is going by really quickly. I could talk to you obviously for hours. Since we're talking about institutions and we're talking about processes, let's say, of post-independent societies that also are spoken about in terms of decoloniality or decolonization, I'm wondering under what conditions can they be achieved successfully? And what is, would you say, is the role also of Western institutions in this process?
Well, I think that in always dealing with the notion of decolonization, and also particularly when it comes to the idea of this conversation of how Western institutions can support in this, it always comes down to the fact that objects which have been taken or possessions which have to be returned and all that. But it's not just as simple as that. I think that the whole problem that we are dealing with within this time is very much of an ideological struggle. So I think that capital is also one that plays a very important role. So in terms of creating spaces, that because Western institutions have benefited a lot also from these objects that have been taken away in all these years. So I think that it's very important for us to find ways in which they can contribute towards the physical infrastructure, and then also developing the human capacity and resource in order to be able to somehow push these new institutions forward into the future. Because the way there are so many gaps to begin with within the histories that we are dealing with. So the pedagogies that I was talking about is one way. And there are a lot of people, of course, on the continent and around the world who've spent most of their life thinking about these different infrastructures and the kind of contributions that they can make to the shift in human experiences from not just from the point of the continent and spaces on the margin, but also coming back also to Western institutions. So I'm thinking more or less that we have to find ways in which we can collaborate beyond capital going into the future.
Wow. Well, this is a time when all kinds of structures it's a time are being deconstructed or collapsing or being critiqued. So perhaps this is a kind of moment also to think beyond the hegemony of certain histories, of certain memories. And what I take from your practice is that you operate as an artist and as a human being on many different levels in terms of through formal means, through kind of material interventions, through urban and spatial interventions, and specifically connecting or bringing to light different memories and histories in multi-directional ways, so that working in Ghana, you are also working with the histories of the non-aligned movement, with Eastern Europe. You're working with the histories of kind of contemporary capital. You are basically somehow inserting yourself into the system, but also producing it in ways that are productive for the community in Tamale, in Accra, etc.
Yes.
If you had, I don't want to say if there's a message, but because you have expressed yourself so beautifully, but if we're thinking about some kind of words for the future, or some thoughts for the future that also may have come from the past, what would they be?
Yeah,
or
well,
that we connect.
I think that for so long, we've always dwelled on the idea of producing new things again and again and again and again. And I think it's also just one of the strong characteristics of like capital and how constantly it aims at exploiting everything that it can find. But I think that in order for us to go into the future, we somehow need to look back into the past. There are a lot of things that need yet to be resolved. We can see with the current crisis, particularly even with the pandemic and also with the Black Lives Matter movement around the world in a quest for justice and order. That when the pandemic hits, one of the things that we were thinking about, it was almost like a cut, a salt in the wound. It exposed most of the Western countries in a way that they've always spoken about the fact that they've somehow reached a certain human pinnacle and then they've been able to solve issues regarding healthcare. But it's always been a lie, because underneath it, once we are still allowing capital to manipulate and control everything, the world is constantly going to be in a certain state of crisis. And I've always thought that the world has been in a state of crisis. So people would ask me, so what would happen after this crisis goes away? And I said, this crisis is just a manifestation of the crisis that there is already. So there are questions that we ought to ask ourselves regarding the struggle of humankind and ultimately the struggle of life in itself. What is the meaning of it? And sometimes maybe we could find answers in like collectivity and the way that people come together in order to somehow address both their problems and then also certain concerns that we have. And I think that if we somehow harness this spirit going more forward in the future and somehow reduce the skepticism that are in the world, there could be more promise for what we could achieve together.
Thank you very much. I mean, I take from you that we have always been living in a state of exception,
yes.
And that this is yet another kind of performance of that state of exception.
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And that around it, we need to work together, as you said, to basically expose the mechanisms
yes.
that are like the salt in the wound.
Exactly.
There's some questions. Yeah. There's some questions also from the public that have been sent to me to ask you.
Okay.
So I'm going to ask them. The first one is, Mr. Mahama, what's your take on Japanese boro, and has it inspired you at all?
Unfortunately, not so much. Yeah, I've spent most of my time actually looking into capital and what it produces actually within society in terms of looking at physical material. But the interesting thing about the work, my practice, is that though I am looking at things on a material level, I'm also looking at it beyond material in terms of how those material forms can maybe contribute towards a shift within ideological forms and values. And I think that is what we need somehow in order to deal with what is yet to come in still in the 21st century and the centuries that are yet to come. That until universally we can somehow come to a certain point of this kind of ideological crisis, it will still be very difficult for us to somehow resolve most of the conversations that there is.
We have just a few more minutes, and I'm just wondering, since both of us have been speaking implicitly and explicitly in Marxist terms, or kind of, structurally Marxist terms, does the education and the pedagogy that takes place at this SCAA, is it also kind of embedded with this kind of historical Marxism, or is it embedded in different discourses as well?
I think different, because most of our audiences are children, so you cannot use that as we don't even discuss these things. So this is more or less what happens in my head or within my own private life as an artist. But I'm trying more or less to find ways in which it can be used as material. Yeah, so I think about the pedagogy as material, as a way to create new spaces within, let's say, given context, and maybe in a much larger context eventually, that can somehow maybe affect in which artists produce work, or artists' responsibility towards each other, or generations that are yet to come, and how they experience art or culture or even science, because there are many things that we look at within the institution. For instance, now we are teaching a group of children drone technology, because I use a lot of drone in my work. So how do we use the idea of drone technology, even in a community where, as the village where the institution is in, like the Red Clay, in order to resolve issues regarding agriculture? How do you think about your body in fixed upon this earth and land, as versus this drone, which is somehow free, like a bird in the sky? How do you use that to to rethink about your position within the space and how you can somehow recultivate your surrounding? So there's a lot of things which are at play, and I think that both Marxist terms and then other theories provide these spaces for us to be able to even operate in this term.
Thank you so much, Ibrahim. Again, we could speak for hours. We only have 35 minutes together today. Yes. But this, moving between this kind of material phenomenological realm and abstraction in terms of capital, and abstraction in terms of surveillance, abstraction in terms of ideologies. I think, your practice is a kind of brilliant and poetic example of maneuvering through all of these complex problems of the past in the way that they're articulated in the present, in order to perhaps come out at a different future.
Yeah, perfect, as you put it.
Well, you said it. I'm just kind of articulating what I've understood from your really poetic work. And since our time is coming to an end, I want to thank everybody for tuning in today, or perhaps later, as this conversation will be archived. I hope you can also tune in to the next Dialogues for Tomorrow, which is taking place on Thursday, the 18th of June at 4 p.m. Central European Time. That conversation will be between Caroline Jones and Eva Kernbauer. Caroline Jones is a professor in the History, Theory, and Criticism section in the Department of Architecture at MIT. And Eva Kernbauer is professor of Modern and Contemporary Art at the Angewandte, the University of Applied Arts. So once again, thank you very much, Ibrahim, and thank you to everyone. And let's continue our conversation.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.